Picture yourself standing beside a campfire nearly 30,000 years ago. The flames flicker against the walls of a dark cave. Outside, wolves howl somewhere beyond the trees. A child sleeps beside the fire. An old woman quietly sharpens a stone tool while everyone else watches her hands with complete attention. She isn't the strongest person in the group. She isn't the fastest hunter, but everyone listens when she speaks. That's strange, because you've probably heard the same claim over and over again. Ancient humans only lived to around 30 years old. If that's true, then who is this old woman? Why would a tribe depend on someone who supposedly shouldn't even be alive? Now picture archaeologists thousands of years later uncovering her skeleton. They estimate she died in her 60s. Suddenly, the story doesn't make sense anymore. Was everything we thought we knew about ancient human life wrong? For decades, the idea that prehistoric people rarely survived beyond 30 has appeared in books, documentaries, and conversations. It sounds believable. Life was dangerous. Predators were everywhere. Disease had no medicine. A single infected wound could become a death sentence, so the number seems to fit. But here's the mystery. The deeper researchers looked into ancient graves, forgotten caves, and the bones left behind by our ancestors, the more that simple number began to fall apart. Think about that for a second. If ancient humans really died at 30, how did knowledge survive across generations? Who taught children to hunt, track animals, make tools, or remember the safest paths through the wilderness? The answer isn't just about age. It's about one of the biggest statistical illusions in human history. And once you see it, you'll never look at the past the same way again. At first glance, the explanation seems almost too obvious. Ancient life was brutally dangerous. Imagine waking before sunrise with no hospitals, no antibiotics, no clean drinking water, and no guarantee that your next hunt would succeed. Every day carried risks that modern life has almost erased. A deep cut from a stone tool could become infected. A harsh winter could wipe out an entire camp. A failed hunt meant hunger. And every journey through the wilderness brought the possibility of crossing paths with wolves, cave lions, or enormous bears. It's easy to see why so many people believe no one lived very long. In fact, when archaeologists began studying prehistoric burial sites, they found something that seemed to support that idea. Many skeletons belonged to teenagers, young adults, or people who appeared to die before reaching middle age. Children were especially common. Some sites revealed heartbreaking numbers of infants who never survived their first few years. The evidence appeared overwhelming. If so many people died young, then surely the average lifespan really was around 30. That conclusion spread everywhere. It found its way into classrooms, documentaries, and everyday conversations. Over time, it stopped being treated as a theory and started sounding like an unquestionable fact. Case closed. Or so it seemed, because one detail refused to fit the story. Mixed among those young skeletons were individuals with heavily worn teeth, healed broken bones, and joints shaped by decades of hard work. These weren't people who had barely reached adulthood. They had lived long enough to become elders, so how could both things be true? How could a population have an average lifespan near 30, while some people clearly survived into their 60s or even beyond? That contradiction wasn't a mistake. It was the first clue that researchers had been asking the wrong question all along. The common belief sounds simple. If the average lifespan was around 30 years, then most people must have died around 30. It feels logical. But statistics don't always tell the story we think they do. Imagine a small prehistoric camp with 10 children. Half of them never survive their 5th birthday. The other 5 grow into adulthood. A few die while hunting. 1 is killed by illness, but 2 eventually live into their 60s. Now calculate the average. Suddenly, the number drops far lower than the age most adults actually reached. The average hasn't lied, but it has hidden something incredibly important. Researchers began comparing prehistoric populations from different regions, expecting the same pattern to repeat. Instead, they noticed something surprising. In many ancient communities, the greatest danger wasn't growing old, it was surviving childhood. The first few years of life were the real battlefield. Without modern medicine, vaccines, or reliable nutrition, infants faced impossible odds. A minor infection, a harsh winter, or a shortage of food could end a life before it had truly begun. Every child who died young pulled the average lifespan downward, making entire populations appear far younger than they really were. Think about that for a second. The famous 30-year lifespan wasn't describing how long adults usually lived. It was describing a population devastated by child mortality. That realization changed everything. If someone reached adulthood, especially their late teens or early 20s, their chances of living for many more decades increased dramatically. Ancient life was still dangerous, but surviving the earliest years meant the future suddenly looked very different. So, why did the myth survive for so long? Why did generations continue repeating the same number, even as new archaeological discoveries painted a far more complicated picture? The answer wasn't buried in ancient bones alone. It was hidden in the way modern people had learned to read the past, and that would lead researchers to one of the most revealing discoveries of all. The contradiction had become impossible to ignore. If ancient adults often lived far beyond 30, why did the myth refuse to disappear? To answer that question, researchers stopped looking at averages and started looking at individual lives. One investigation led them to hundreds of prehistoric skeletons recovered from caves, river valleys, and ancient burial grounds across Europe and Asia. Instead of asking, how long did this population live? They asked a much more revealing question: who actually reached old age? The team examined tiny clues hidden inside the bones, teeth worn smooth after decades of chewing tough food, joints permanently reshaped by years of walking, hunting, and carrying heavy loads, fractures that had healed long before death, proving these people survived serious injuries and continued living for many years afterward. Each skeleton told a different story. Then the pattern emerged. There were far more older adults than the old averages had led anyone to expect. Some individuals had lived well into their 50s, 60s, and possibly even beyond. More surprising still, many of these elders had survived injuries that would have been impossible to recover from alone. Broken legs had healed, damaged arms had regained strength, crushed ribs had knitted back together. Think about what that means. Someone had protected them. Someone had brought them food, defended them from predators, and waited while they recovered. These weren't isolated survivors fighting for themselves. They were members of communities willing to invest months or even years, keeping older people alive. That discovery changed the question entirely. The mystery was no longer whether ancient humans could grow old. Clearly, many of them did. The real mystery was why small hunter-gatherer groups would spend precious time and resources caring for people who could no longer hunt as fast as everyone else. The answer wasn't simply about survival. It was about something far more valuable than strength. And that clue would transform our understanding of what made humans different from every other species. To understand why growing old mattered, we have to meet someone who lived thousands of years ago. Not a king, not a warrior, just an ordinary woman whose bones were discovered decades later in a prehistoric burial site. When archaeologists first uncovered her skeleton, one detail immediately stood out. Most of her teeth were gone. The few that remained were worn almost flat, polished by a lifetime of chewing tough roots, dried meat, and coarse plants. Her spine carried the marks of countless seasons spent walking across rugged landscapes. Arthritis had stiffened several of her joints, and old fractures in her ribs had healed long before she died. By every measure, she had lived a hard life. But the most remarkable clue wasn't what had happened to her. It was what happened after those hardships. Despite her age and physical condition, she had survived for years. Imagine trying to keep up with a migrating hunting group while barely able to chew your food. Picture long winters when every piece of meat mattered, yet someone still chose to share it with you instead of saving it for the youngest or the strongest. That wasn't an accident. It was a decision. Every meal she received represented a choice made by the people around her. Researchers began asking an unexpected question. Why would a small tribe, where every resource was precious, continue caring for someone who could no longer contribute in the same way as younger hunters? Then another possibility emerged. Maybe they weren't keeping her alive out of kindness alone. Maybe she possessed something far more valuable than physical strength. She remembered. She knew where water could still be found after months of drought. She recognized which plants healed wounds and which ones caused death. She carried memories of dangerous predators, changing seasons, and forgotten hunting routes that no child could possibly know. Suddenly, old age looked less like a burden and more like humanity's greatest survival tool. But could wisdom really be valuable enough to change the course of an entire species? The more researchers uncovered, the clearer one truth became. This wasn't just a story about one prehistoric woman. It was a pattern that appeared again and again, across continents, across thousands of years, and even beyond our own species. Imagine a herd of elephants crossing the African savanna. When a drought arrives, the youngest elephants don't know where water is hidden, but the oldest female does. She remembers rivers that vanished decades earlier and paths the herd has never walked before. Again and again, scientists have watched entire elephant families survive because they followed the memory of their oldest member. Now picture a pod of killer whales gliding through icy northern waters. Long after they stop having calves, older females continue leading their families. They remember where salmon return during difficult seasons. Their experience helps younger whales survive years when food becomes scarce. Pretty strange, right? Nature keeps repeating the same idea. Experience can be more valuable than strength. Then researchers looked back at human history, and the pattern became even larger. From the Aboriginal peoples of Australia to the Inuit of the Arctic, from African hunter-gatherers to the first farming villages of the Middle East, elders carried something no one else possessed. They remembered hidden waterholes, dangerous migrations, edible plants, changing climates, ancient traditions, and the stories that held entire communities together. Knowledge wasn't written in books. It was stored inside people. Lose an elder, and a library disappeared. Suddenly, caring for older adults no longer looked like an act of compassion alone. It looked like one of humanity's greatest survival strategies. Civilizations weren't built only by the strongest hunters. They were built by generations willing to protect the people who remembered what everyone else had forgotten. But that realization uncovered an even deeper mystery. If elders were so valuable throughout history, and even in other intelligent species, why did modern society become so convinced that ancient humans almost never lived long enough to become one? But every great pattern has its exceptions, and those exceptions forced researchers to ask even harder questions. Not every ancient community had large numbers of elders. Some really did lose most of their adults at young ages. Picture a small hunting band trapped during an unusually harsh winter. Game animals disappear, rivers freeze, food runs out. Within weeks, even the healthiest adults begin to weaken. In situations like these, experience alone couldn't defeat starvation. Then there were communities struck by violence. Archaeologists have uncovered prehistoric burial sites where entire groups appear to have died within a short period, many showing signs of fatal injuries from arrows, clubs, or spears. In these places, older adults were just as vulnerable as everyone else, and disease could change everything. Long before written history, infections and epidemics occasionally swept through human groups. Without medicine, even a community rich in knowledge could lose an entire generation in a matter of weeks, so the rule wasn't absolute. Growing old was never guaranteed. It depended on something much bigger than biology: climate, food, conflict, luck. Researchers also discovered another important clue. Ancient humans didn't all live under the same conditions. A tribe living beside rich rivers or productive coastlines often had far better odds of supporting older members than a group struggling across frozen tundra or drought-stricken plains. Think about that. There was never a single prehistoric lifespan. There were thousands of different human stories. Some ended far too early. Others stretched across 6 or 7 remarkable decades. And those rare survivors would become the final piece of the puzzle, because they revealed that the real measure of ancient humanity wasn't how long people could live. It was how communities made long lives possible. By now, the question has completely changed. We didn't begin by asking whether ancient humans could live beyond 30. We began by asking whether they ever had the chance. And that's the difference that changes everything. The famous claim that ancient humans died at 30 was never really describing an individual life. It was describing a population, a statistic, one heavily shaped by an enormous number of children who never reached adulthood. Imagine 2 villages. In the first, half the children die before their 5th birthday. but many adults reach 60 or even 70. In the second, almost every child survives, yet adults rarely live past 65. The first village could end up with the lower average lifespan. Even though its adults often lived nearly as long as people do in many parts of the world today, think about how misleading that is. For centuries, we've confused life expectancy at birth with the maximum age people were capable of reaching. Those are two completely different questions. And once archaeologists, anthropologists, and demographers separated them, the mystery finally made sense. Ancient humans weren't a species designed to die young. They were a species forced to survive an incredibly dangerous beginning. If you made it through childhood, escaped disease, avoided predators, survived accidents, and found a community willing to protect one another, growing old was no longer extraordinary. In fact, many people did. That's why archaeologists keep uncovering skeletons with healed fractures, advanced arthritis, worn teeth, and decades of physical wear. These aren't the remains of people whose lives ended at 30. They're evidence of lives that kept going, long enough to become teachers, storytellers, healers, and living memories. And perhaps that's the greatest misunderstanding of all. Human evolution wasn't driven only by stronger muscles or sharper weapons. It was driven by communities that refused to abandon experience. The oldest members weren't simply survivors. They became humanity's memory. Every hunting route, every medicinal plant, every lesson learned from famine, fire, or predator attacks could be carried across generations by people who had lived long enough to remember. So when someone says, ancient humans only lived to 30, they're repeating a number. But numbers don't tell stories. People do. And the real story is that civilization wasn't built by those who died young. It was built by those who survived long enough to teach everyone else how not to. Now return to that campfire. The flames still dance against the cave walls. The night is just as cold. Wolves still call from somewhere beyond the darkness. Children sit quietly watching the oldest woman in the group as she traces invisible paths across the ground with a piece of charcoal. She isn't showing them where they have been. She's showing them where they will survive tomorrow. No one in the camp is thinking about averages. No one knows what life expectancy means. All they know is that every scar she carries is a lesson. Every wrinkle is a memory. Every year she has survived is knowledge that doesn't have to be learned again through tragedy. Maybe that's what made humans different. Not that we lived longer than every other creature, but that we found a way to turn long lives into something greater than survival, into wisdom, into culture, into civilization. The story of humanity was never written only by the young who ran the fastest or hunted the best. It was also written by the elders who remembered the last great winter, the hidden spring beyond the mountains, and the mistake that should never be repeated. So the next time you hear someone say, ancient humans died at 30, remember the old woman by the fire, because the future of our species may never have depended on how long people could live, but on what they chose to pass on before the fire finally burned out.